So you guys all know me. That's good. So what I'm going to talk to you guys about is the third chapter of my dissertation, which relates to a lot of the things that some of you have seen before. But specifically what I'm going to be talking about here, and what I'm going to set the mood, I'm going to be talking about inequality. So in order to kind of frame this discussion, I just want to get it started with a couple of examples. So there is, a global crisis of inequality. I think it's fair to say inequalities are getting extremely extreme at this point, and there's a really interesting thing going on, which is a lot of people are talking about it, and there's a lot of interest being raised about it. Not just, of course, this is happening amongst scholars, academics, but it's also happening just amongst people in general. So Bernie Sanders, who identifies himself as a democratic socialist, was a major candidate for presidential election, and there's a lot of and I think it's a lot because of that particular issue. People are really drawn towards this issue of inequality, and he is continually, that is one thing he's very consistently vocal about. So I want to there's an example that he gave in an article from a couple of weeks ago, and the article was in The Guardian, and it was called Let's Wrench Power Back from the Billionaires, which is a very relevant to the subject of this talk that I'm going to give today. So he gives an example about Jeff Bezos. So he's the founder of Amazon, right? Everybody knows wealthiest person in the world. I think he has over $100 billion, which is an unfathomable amount of money. He has, of course, as people with that much money, it just makes sense for them to do, he has at least 4 mansions, together worth many tens of millions of dollars. And he's also spending, this is the example, $42 million for the construction of a clock inside of a mountain that will, supposedly it's going to run for 10,000 years. Whether or not we'll be around for that is another question. But this is what this clock is going to do. So he's spending $42 million on that. At the same time, Amazon workers, many of them are extremely impoverished, working in potentially unsafe conditions in many respects. Many of them are relying on Medicaid, food stamps, and public housing that are paid for by U.S. taxpayers. So we've got this very, very extreme divergence and difference in the wealth amongst people in the country and the world. So pretty much everybody is going to agree that there's something wrong going on when some people have that much money and like $1 billion, what is it to have $1 billion? Well, others are not having enough to really keep above water, keep their heads above water and stay afloat. So I've argued elsewhere, and this is my writing sample for those of you that looked at it, that people have a right to the basic resources required for agency. What I'm going to argue today is that beyond these basic resources, our economic system also has to be compatible with equal democratic citizenship. So this means that citizens must have access to the socioeconomic resources that are required for equal democratic citizenship. And I'm also going to argue that this means that we have to do away with inequalities that are so extreme that they undermine equal democratic citizenship. So I'm, of course, going to make this argument from a Kantian perspective. Kant argues in his Metaphysics of Morals that each person has what he calls the innate right to freedom, the one innate right. So this means each person has the right to direct her will in the external world consistently with others' rights to do the same. So you guys have probably, those of you who came yesterday probably have heard me emphasizing that consistently with others' rights to do the same a lot. So I'm going to keep doing that today. So I argue that this fundamental right to freedom entails a right to equal democratic citizenship, another thing that overlaps with yesterday. In order to secure the right to freedom, then, what we have to do is secure the conditions of equal democratic citizenship. So the fact that I'm using Kant to make this sort of an argument is going to be something that may be surprising to anyone who is familiar with Kant's political philosophy, even just loosely. So something that Kant does say is that individuals' freedom is, and this is a quote, quite consistent with the greatest inequality in terms of the quantity and degree of their possessions. Now, there's some questions about context there about exactly what he meant, but there's definitely there have been many sort of libertarian interpretations of Kant's political philosophy. And a notable example of this is Hayek. So Hayek relied on Kant's moral principles to argue that, to ground his criticism of the welfare state. But regardless of Kant's stated views, my aim here is not to be interpreting Kant, but to be taking Kant's fundamental principles, just starting with those, and arguing that those principles entail robust socioeconomic rights, even if Kant himself didn't see that these robust socioeconomic rights were an entailment of these principles. And I think that it's even more important to be making this argument from a Kantian perspective, given the way the Kantian perspective and the Kantian principles have been used in the past. Because when you look at the arguments that people are making against placing restrictions on the market and against taxing heavily to eliminate inequalities, these arguments are overwhelmingly relying on rhetoric of freedom, and a type of freedom that sounds something like the type of freedom that Kant is talking about. So the idea here is that taxing Jeff Bezos violates his freedom, so it takes away what is rightfully his. So people argue either that we don't have a right to tax Jeff Bezos, or if we do decide to tax Jeff Bezos, what we're doing is trading off his freedom for something else that we value more. For example, the sake of equality or something, and that there might be a tension between freedom and equality. So on my view, though, there is no trade-off between the values of freedom and equality. So citizens, on my view, have a right to freedom, and so they have a right to equal democratic citizenship and equality before the law more broadly. And securing the conditions of equal democratic citizenship, then, is not something that's going to violate freedom. It's instead something that is going to both secure equal citizenship and, in so doing, secure their right to freedom as well. So there's no tension, then, between freedom and equality. Okay, so that's the general shape of what I'm going to do. Now, getting into the specifics, the first thing I want to get into is giving an account of the Kantian right to freedom. So Kant argues, again, that each person has the one innate right to freedom, and as he puts it, and this is on your handout, freedom, independence from being constrained by another's choice, insofar as it can coexist with the freedom of every other in accordance with the universal law, is the one original right belonging to every man by virtue of his humanity. So it's first really important to note that this idea of freedom, this right to freedom, is different from the Kantian idea of autonomy that we hear about in Kant's moral philosophy. So freedom in the ethical theory, Kant's ethical theory, involves doing things for the right reasons and acting from moral duty, internal freedom. Kant's theory of right is concerned specifically with external freedom, so with the free exercise of one's will in the external world, protected from interference by others. So according to Kant, each person is going to necessarily have the right to freedom, the innate right to freedom. So again, what this is going to mean is each person has the right to direct her own will consistently with others' rights to do the same. And this last part is the really, really important part. So my right to freedom does not include a right to act in ways that restrict other people's freedom. And I think that this universalizability, this sense in which everyone's freedom is consistent, is one of the most important aspects of the Kantian right to freedom. And I also think that this universalizability is the reason why the Kantian idea of freedom has so much to offer in debates about things like inequality, and of course I'll say more about later. And I'm going to give you a bit more detail in a minute about the right to freedom, but before I do that, I want to talk to you about a contrast between the Kantian right to freedom and another very influential conception of freedom and the right to freedom, in order to demonstrate why this aspect of universalizability is so significant. So I want to contrast the Kantian right to freedom and idea of freedom with freedom as negative liberty. So with the conception of freedom as negative liberty, as you guys probably recognize Isaiah Berlin's definitive characterization of that, a right to freedom is a right to non-interference. So I'm free insofar as I can do whatever it is that I choose to do without interference from others. So as Isaiah Berlin puts it, and this is a quote, "If I am prevented by others from doing what I could otherwise do, I am to that degree unfree." So any restriction on what I can do is a restriction of my freedom. So another important aspect of this idea of freedom is that freedoms on this view are necessarily going to come into conflict. You cannot avoid this. So on this picture, political decision-making is going to be viewed as making choices to trade off some freedoms for others. To see what I mean here, I think let's look at the case of assault. So on the view of freedom as negative liberty, in the case of assault, what we're doing is we're trading off one person's freedom, the freedom of the person who wants to do some assault. We're trading off that freedom, restricting that activity that that person might wish to engage in for the sake of a freedom that we value more, which is going to be the would-be victim's freedom from assault, her bodily integrity. So there's a trade-off there. And for some reason, we value one of those freedoms more than others. So the Kantian idea of freedom is going to give you a much different analysis of what's going on in this case. So there's no trade-off in the assault case on the Kantian picture. So on the Kantian picture, again, a person's right to freedom does not include a right to violate other people's freedoms. So there's no trade-off. My right doesn't include a right to assault another person. You have the right to direct your own will in the external world. My right to direct my own will in the external world doesn't include a right to interfere with your directing of your own will. So when I attack a person, somebody else has a right to her directing her own will in the world, her own bodily integrity. And when I assault her, I'm violating that right. I'm overstepping. I'm not just directing my own will, I'm trying to direct yours as well. So forbidding me from attacking, assaulting somebody doesn't violate or restrict my freedom. It's just protecting hers. So this is what I mean when I'm saying that the Kantian right to freedom is universalizable. So on this picture, everybody's freedom, each person's freedom is consistent with everyone else's freedom, and there's also no conflict between specific freedoms. So all of the rights that are entailed by the one innate right to freedom are going to be consistent with one another. So there's no trading off on this view. So freedom is the one innate right from which all others flow on the Kantian picture, and it can never, never be legitimately traded off for anything else. So in this sense, the Kantian right to freedom is an inviolable right, an inalienable right. And I think that the idea of freedom as negative liberty just cannot give rise to the same level of absolute inalienable right, and for the simple reason that it's strange to think of an inalienable right or an absolute right that needs to be traded off with itself. That's in conflict with itself. It can't be absolute in the same sense. Okay, so that's the difference between freedom as negative liberty and the Kantian idea of freedom. Now I want to tell you a little bit more about what it is to have the innate right to freedom. So Kant said that there were some authorizations contained within the right to freedom, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but I think what he means here is just what it means to have the right to freedom means that you also have the right to these authorizations. Having these authorizations just is what it is to have the right to freedom. So I think two of these authorizations are going to be key to developing a Kantian argument for equal democratic citizenship. So I'm just going to focus on these two. There are some others as well, but they're not as important here, I think. So the first one, and this is on your handout, is, quote, innate equality, that is independence from being bound by others to more than one can in turn bind them. So each person has this innate right to freedom, and this is the innate right to direct her will in the external world. So this one fundamental right, it's the same for everyone. And on this picture, I've already said this, the right to freedom is the one innate right from which all others are flowing. So the specific rights that a given individual has then are going to follow from this one innate right to freedom, which is the same for everyone, and the specific circumstances in which an individual finds herself and her specific conditions. So then different people in the same circumstances then are always going to have the same rights because they're being considered solely in virtue of their innate right to freedom, of course applied to this particular circumstances in which they find themselves. And since everybody has the same innate right to freedom, all are going to be equally and reciprocally bound to respect one another's right to freedom in the same way. So if others are bound to respect me more than I am bound to respect them, there is something going wrong here. So it must either be the case that others are being bound to respect me more than my right to freedom demands, or I am not being held to the standard of respecting them as much as their right to freedom demands. So if there's an inequality in authority, then to the extent that one person is being respected more, that person is to that extent the master of the other person, which transitions into the second authorization that Kant talks about, which is self-mastery. So and this is also on your handout, the second authorization is, quote, a human being's quality of being his own master. So in saying that this authorization is contained within the right to freedom, I think what Kant is saying is that part of what it means to have the innate right to freedom, the innate right to direct my own will in the external world, is having the right to be the master of my own will. So I have the right to decide what I will do, so long as this right doesn't conflict with your right to do the same thing, to decide what you will do. So we're all equally bound to respect each other's innate right to freedom, which means that we're equally bound to respect each other's rights to be our own masters. So if one person is bound more to another, then that other is in turn bound to her. The person who is disproportionately bound is, as I was saying before, to that extent subjugated to the other person's will. Okay, so, and we'll get into this more, obviously, with inequality and how that relates here. So, Kant's theory of right is built on this foundation of the innate right to freedom. And the fundamental principle of Kant's theory of right, which he calls the universal principle of right, binds us, commands us to protect and secure, not violate, this innate right to freedom. And this is also on your handout. And as Kant puts it, quote, any action is right if it can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with the universal law, or if on its maxim, freedom of choice of each can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with the universal law. So actions that violate anyone's freedom, or multiple people's freedom, must be prohibited by the state. So this universal principle of right doesn't just bear, obviously, on the actions of individuals, and I think this is really important for what we're going to be talking about today, where it's much more than just individual actions that we're concerned with. So Kant speaks not only of the possibility of a person's action violating another person's right to freedom, but also the possibility of one's, as he put it, condition generally violating another's freedom. So there's a real lot there to think about in terms of Kant interpretation, but what I'm taking from it for my purposes here today is just what he's saying is this: individuals have to be prohibited from violating one another's rights, but also we must not allow our system of government, the conditions that we're creating, to violate or be inconsistent with the rights of people generally as well. Okay, so now we've got the right to freedom. We understand the contrast with negative liberty. So the next step is to give a Kantian argument for equal democratic citizenship. So having the innate right to freedom means being fundamentally equal to all others. It also means having the right to be the master of your own will. So let's think now about what this is going to mean about how our state should be organized. So in the easy case, in the first instance, what we're all going to have is personal bodily rights. So this is hopefully something we can all agree on. Good. So we are all equally and reciprocally bound to respect one another's bodily rights. So we have the same right to freedom, which means we have to direct our own rights, direct our own wills in the external world, which means that each person has the right, pretty simply, to control her own mind, her own body. And this right is the same for all of us. But I think that being bound to reciprocally respect one another's personal bodily rights isn't sufficient to ensure that each person is her own master and is going to be equal to all others. So we also have to make, beyond just protecting these individual rights, we have to make decisions about how our society will be structured and organized. So the government is the institution through which we do this, through which we make these decisions. And so the government is going to be something that is exercising control over us. So for example, we have to put in place a regime of traffic laws, even if that's saying just do whatever you want. So we have to pick a side of the road. This is something that's helpful, that people can drive on, among other things, like where to put the lights and whether we do the curly things or not. I know those have a better name, but that's definitely not my area of expertise. So these decisions, they have to be made. And some people or groups of people have to make these decisions. So these decisions are also going to be binding over all of us. Deciding which side of the road to drive on doesn't really help if people don't actually drive on that side of the road. We have to get the system working. So I'm thinking that the only way for governmental authority over us to be consistent with our right to self-mastery is for this government to be an exercise of our self-mastery. So this is a fundamentally Rousseauian idea that Kant takes up when he argues, and this is a quote, "The legislative authority can belong only to the united will of the people." So Kant says that in order for laws to legitimately bind all citizens, they have to be the product of what he calls an omnilateral will, which we talked a little bit about yesterday as well, which is a general united will composed of the wills of all individual citizens individually united together. Okay, so there's a decent amount of evidence that Kant himself, again, Kant keeps making trouble for me, he only endorsed what a Kant scholar named Christopher Hainish, I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, what he refers to as a, quote, substantive criterion for Republican legitimacy. So rather than arguing that citizens have to give laws to themselves through democratic processes, Kant seemed to argue that only that laws must be such that citizens could have given them to themselves through democratic processes, or they could have given them laws to themselves. Despite Kant's stated views, again, I'm not trying to interpret Kant, and I actually think there is room for disagreeing with this view of Kant. And there's also a lot more to be said about Kant on inequality, too. But despite Kant's stated views, I think that the right to freedom does entail that citizens must actually give those laws to themselves through democratic processes. And procedures. So in order for our laws to actually be a product of our general united will, it needs to actually be the case that these laws are the product of our will. So that's the very simple version of the argument. Usually some people are right on board with me there, but I'm going to keep going with it for a bit just to make the case a little bit stronger. So each person has to be her own master. She has the right to be her own master. If an individual person acting as a sovereign were to govern in a republican way, choosing only the laws that citizens could give to themselves, and perhaps even those laws, only those laws that we actually would give to ourselves, if we were allowed to, even if that's happening, even in that best case scenario, I still think that those citizens are not actually giving themselves those laws, and that is really important. So their wills are subordinated to the will of the sovereign. And so this condition is going to be inconsistent with the innate equality of all citizens, under which no person can be subject to another, in this sense of having fundamental authority over another. So, and this is going to be true anytime one person or any group of people has disproportionate lawmaking authority over others. So in order for the laws to be consistent with our right to self-mastery, we must actually give these laws to ourselves. And in order for laws to be consistent with our innate equality, we all have to have an equal part in giving these laws to ourselves. So it's important, I think, to note, though, that on the Kantian picture, laws can be the product of a democratic lawmaking process and still be illegitimate. So the right to freedom is going to place pretty robust substantive limitations on what we can legitimately decide via our democratic decision-making process. So any law that's inconsistent with the fundamental right to freedom will be illegitimate. And this is, of course, a really big can of worms to open as far as what exactly these Republican limitations are going to be. And it would take a lot of work to identify and give an account of all the ways in which we will limit our lawmaking process. Of course, in the US, we have a lot of examples of this, ways in which you might think that our right to freedom, which is something we talk about in our Constitution, these sorts of things, is secured by our Bill of Rights, for example, and these sorts of things. And I also want to give you an example to make this idea a little bit more concrete about how we're going to place limits on the democratic lawmaking process. And I want to just flag for you that this example is disturbing and kind of upsetting, but I think that's why it's such a good example, because it is something that is so clearly in violation of the fundamental right to freedom. So marital rape laws in the United States, up until 1993, it was legal in some states in this country, although I think maybe some people aren't even aware of this. It was legal to rape your wife up until 1993. So permitting violations of bodily integrity of this sort would be a prime example of a law that's inconsistent with the right to freedom. It cannot be legitimate in any case. So, and this is actually what the Supreme Courts of these states decided, finally. In 1993, when these states still have these laws on the books, the judgments actually do talk about a fundamental freedom, fundamental right to bodily integrity, and so found this to be something that even if you have a statute, criminal law statute, that's saying that this is something that is acceptable, it can't be. Okay, so we're going to have our Republican limitations on the right to freedom. So the right to freedom is going to entail a Republican state where fundamental freedoms are insulated in some way from the democratic process. Now, how exactly that needs to be in a constitution or a Bill of Rights, whether written or unwritten, not getting into that. I think there are different ways we could do this. But I also want to say beyond these Republican limitations, there are some things I think that we can say about what is that noise? Let's just ignore it. It sounds like mice. So I don't really mind that much. What a legitimate legislative system is going to have to look like. Oh, okay. So if we're each going to have, so we're getting back to what is this democratic legislative process going to have to look like? I could talk all day about what a democratic process has to or could look like, or what the right to freedom is going to mean about what it should look like. There's so much that we can say about that. We can fill 100 books. But I think there are some really fundamental, just basic things that we can say about what the legislative process has to look like. So first of all, if we're each going to have an equal part in governing, then we have to have some sort of a way that we can take part in governing. So there must then be some sort of democratic process by which we exercise this right, and some sort of voting then, or a similar voting type thing. And also, if we're all going to have an equal part in our democracy, then our votes must be weighted equally. So one person, one vote type of situation. So there are certainly still a great many details yet to be settled about what exactly the process is going to have to look like. Setting this aside, I have lots of, maybe not too many opinions, but there are just so many. But if you want to talk about it more in Q&A, I would be happy to talk about it then. But what I want to focus on, instead of the details about what the democratic process is going to look like, is what this means, what this fundamental right for equal democratic citizenship means for what our socioeconomic system has to be like, and what our socioeconomic rights are. So I think that socioeconomic rights follow from this fundamental right to equal democratic citizenship, which follows from the right to freedom. So what I'm going to argue about moving forward is that the right to democratic citizenship entails a right to the material resources required for citizenship in the first instance. So that's the next thing that I'm going to talk about. And then from there, I'm going to argue that we can't permit inequalities that are so extreme that they undermine the conditions of equal democratic citizenship. And that's going to be the last part of the talk. So then let's talk about the socioeconomic resources required for citizenship. So at this point, we've had our justification for equal democratic citizenship. And I think, though, that the formal right to participate in the legislative process is not going to be enough to secure this equal right to equal democratic citizenship. So I think that we have to also make sure that our economic and property system, as well as the distribution of socioeconomic resources more broadly understood, is compatible with the right to equal democratic citizenship. So I think intuitively, although at this point we in this room are probably so far past our intuitions that this may be less the case, but intuitively we might think that how we structure our property and economic system and how we allocate socioeconomic resources is outside the realm of what we should exercise political control over. So the idea here is that the capitalist system is a natural or the natural way for an economic system to be organized. So it's governed by its own laws. Most prominently, we might think some version of survival of the fittest governs who succeeds in the market. So on this view, it's up to us to secure our own access to these resources. And if we don't succeed in doing it, then that's no one else's fault. It might not even be our fault, really. It could just be misfortune or something like that. But it's not somebody else's responsibility, is the important point. So deciding who gets access to these resources on this view is beyond the realm of what the government should appropriately be doing. So I think that with the perspective that we have within our capitalist economic system, this intuition is pervasive. So it's hard to get out of this mindset of accepting capitalism as just being there, as some sort of a natural phenomenon. What I think this intuition does, though, is obscure our own responsibility for our economic and property systems. So we create and maintain our system of ownership and exchange. When we create a state, we together take control over the resources, material resources in our state. The government has to create a regime of ownership and exchange, which is going to be a body of laws, formal or informal, that specify who owns what and how what we own can be transferred to someone else. So how we acquire objects. So it's going to specify the kinds of rights that we can have with regard to the objects, in addition to specifying how we transfer objects, how we acquire them from each other. So in order for our legal regime of ownership and exchange, just like any other law, in order for it to be legitimate on this Kantian picture where we're all equal and we're all masters of ourselves, these laws have to be created by this idea of the omnilateral will again. We have to make these laws together in order for them to be binding over all of us. So our system of ownership and exchange then is going to be something that we all create and maintain. So, and as I've argued in depth elsewhere, we have options in setting up the regime of ownership and exchange. And this is, again, something I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A, or a paper that I'd be happy to send along as well. So our system doesn't have to be the way that it is. So we make a choice in setting up our regime of ownership and exchange. And this choice, this system, has to be compatible with the right to freedom. So we have to recognize that we already do control who has access to what. And we have created already a legal regime that determines who gets access to what resources. So we are, even if it's the market doing this, we've put that mechanism in place to do this. So we're responsible for the socioeconomic consequences our economic system generates. So we have to make sure these consequences are compatible with our fundamental rights. So if, as I argue, and I have just argued before, we have this right to equal democratic citizenship, which follows from our fundamental right to freedom, then we can't put in place a system where certain people lack access to the socioeconomic resources that are required for equal democratic citizenship. So the key part of my argument here is what I've just argued, which is that we, through our government, must make sure citizens have access to the socioeconomic resources that are required for equal democratic citizenship, whatever they may be. But I want to take a few minutes more to talk specifically about some of these rights and what they would be, just to sort of these rights that are socioeconomic rights required for equal democratic citizenship. And I'm not trying to give like a comprehensive account of all of the things we have to have in order to have a right to equal democratic citizenship, but I just want to give some examples to show how these arguments work within the Kantian framework and how some really important rights are going to fit in. And I'm definitely thinking socioeconomic resources more broadly. So the first example, what I want to talk to you guys about is education. So it's pretty straightforward, I think, that a person has to have some amount of education in order to be participating in any legislative process in a way that is informed and autonomous not meaning here in the Kantian moral sense, but just in the normal sense of the word. So what education is required for citizenship in a given state is going to vary relative to that state and the particular nature of that state. So in a general sense, at a minimum, a person is going to have a basic level of education. So whatever amount of training in basic subjects, like what would the 3 R's in the U.S., reading, writing, and arithmetic, or something like that, or whatever is going to be required for participation in that society. So in the U.S., for example, citizens have to be taught how to read, we might think, in order to really be participating in the legislative process. Which doesn't, of course, mean that I'm not saying that we should take away a right to vote from people that cannot read. I'm simply saying they have the right to be taught how to read. Okay, so we can imagine a different state, not like the US though, different sort of state. Let's imagine a state that's focused on subsistence farming and has maybe like a town hall system of government or something like that. So in that state, teaching people how to read, it might not be necessary, and it might also not be possible. So this is going to explain the variable character of fundamental socioeconomic rights of this sort. So beyond a basic level of education, though, I think that people of a particular state also have to be taught the specific skills that are required for actually participating in the state's legislative process. So another Kantian, and her name is Sarah Holtman, she puts this point really well in a case of a system like the U.S. When she writes that citizens must be taught, quote, those capacities or characteristics that make possible appreciation of, commitment to, and wise choice within the constraints of the dictates of justice. So evidently among these are access to an ability to evaluate empirical facts, the capacity to reason well regarding the relationship between relevant facts and the requirements of justice, and full understanding of, commitment to, and ability to exercise good judgment regarding the basic demands of justice, which is a little bit idealistic in thinking that we might actually be able to make this happen, but it's a right that something that we should trying to be succeeding in teaching people. So I agree with Holtman that effective participation in the legislative process requires the development of reasoning and deliberative capacities. So we don't need to understand everything. We don't have to be taught the specifics of every issue that's of central importance to our state. But we do need to be able to do things like evaluate the expertise of others who are presenting us with information. So for example, climate change. So we do need to understand the basics of the science to a certain extent. But possibly even more importantly than this, we need to have the skills to be able to discern how and when and to what extent we should trust scientific expertise and expertise more generally. Okay, so that's the rough sketch of a right to education within this picture. Now I want to talk about the right to information, which I think is a fun one. So we can't just have education. We can't make decisions if we don't also have the information that's relevant to making that decision. So the most obvious consequence of this is going to be that our government can't be legitimately denying us the information we need to be exercising our vote, again, in an informed manner. So beyond this, though, that's the basic case. Beyond this, I think we also have to have a press that is free and free from governmental control and interference in really important ways. And this press has to be able to tell us what's going on in our state and around the world, and it has to be able to vigorously and without bias investigate issues, as far as we can get, as close to without bias as we can get, investigate these issues that we as a society should be concerned with or are concerned with. So in order to make these decisions about what we should do, these central democratic decisions, what issues our government should address, how they should address them, we need to know about these issues. So if the state or particular citizens are controlling what information other citizens have access to regarding a particular issue, then the citizens that control the information, or the state which controls the information, control those citizens' opinions on the subject. You can't form a negative opinion if you don't have the negative information that would give you that negative opinion. So they decide, whoever has the information decides how others are looking at the issue because they control what information the others see. So this right to have access to information includes a right to be free from propaganda, for example. So another example of right to information, this is also going to bear on the current debate we have in the U.S. about net neutrality, for example. So if corporations control what information we see, they control, again, our perspectives on these issues, these central issues that our nation is facing. So we're each supposed to be making our own free, autonomous decisions about what we think our country should do, and we can't make our own choices on these issues if somebody else, anyone else, whether private or public, is in control of